Greetings. Today we're going to talk about Chapter 6 on Gonzaelz and Harris, Islam in the Midwest. So in this chapter we're looking at the Islamic community in Dearborn, Michigan, and kind of doing a comparison to families in that community with a family that's depicted on a television show, American Muslim. And what's really interesting here in the beginning of this text is, who do we see? And certainly we see, right, people, whatever, but who do we see? How do our expectations influence us to see what is presented in front of us, or even how we see what's presented in front of us? So this diaspora, which is a body of people living outside their traditional homeland, so this body of Islamic people are living in this area and are being portrayed on this television show, and we're getting complaints because they're not being depicted as terrorists. Which, when you first hear that, it sounds really weird, but it really kind of leads us to believe, how does what we expect shape what we see? So a great example of this, two examples that I have of this. First is a Filipino dish that I once ate. It was a dessert, and it was a parfait, right? Parfait, everybody likes parfait. Thank you, donkey. And this parfait, it was, right, layers of ice cream and layers of fillings in between the ice cream and whipped cream. And it was really good, except for that some of the layers included white beans, like, navy beans, and corn. Those were two of the later layers. I think you also had strawberries, and it tasted fine. But what really threw me is I could not get over the fact that I was eating beans and corn with ice cream. And it wasn't that it tasted bad, because it didn't, but I just couldn't eat very much of it because of my expectation of what corn is, what beans are, what you eat them with, and you don't eat them with ice cream, right? So the expectations really influenced how I liked or didn't like this dessert. Another really good example about how these things influence us, I have a friend who is of Chinese descent, and she lives in Mississippi. So she speaks with a very southern accent. And people just kind of can't wrap their heads around the fact of, here's this Chinese-looking person speaking with a strong southern accent. So our expectations really influence what's put in front of us. So in this case, the idea that we have about, in this country, about Islam equals Muslim equals terrorists really influenced how people saw that particular television show. And if we're looking at things that are presented in here, again, kind of contrasting them to our expectations, that's something that I think is really interesting within this chapter. So gender roles, right? And they talk about the Quran in there and the interpretation of whether the woman, or the man rather, is superior over the woman or taking care of the woman, right? There's the intellectual conversation there. And again, people kind of have these expectations about what it means to be Islamic and therefore Muslim and therefore a Muslim woman, right? What does that mean? And a lot of the expectations that have been designed for us through the media, for those who don't know people who are Islamic and or Muslim, we have particular expectations, which would probably guide us towards choosing superior rather than taking care of. But then again, if you look at our own culture, and we've talked about this a little bit before, who mows the lawn when you were growing up? Well, okay, maybe the kids when they were old enough to. But if they weren't old enough to, who mowed the lawn? Right? 99% of the time, not that high, but okay, but a lot, it's the father figure, right? It's the male in the household who does the quote-unquote outdoor work most of the time, and the female who does the indoor work, quote-unquote, most of the time. So really thinking about how does what we expect influence it, but the fact that our expectations, when they match our everyday lived experience, then it's no big deal for us. But when they don't match our lived experience, all of a sudden it's weird and different, right? So same thing with the section on marriage and sex. There's this conflict of her not being interested in marriage and the parents disapproving because she wants to open up a club, and the parents don't like that because there's going to be alcohol. Again, as we kind of look at this, we look at it through the mirror of U.S. Possibly dominant culture person who is going to look at this and say, oh, well, let her do what she wants, right? That's kind of the understanding that we're going into. But there are things that people are not, quote unquote, allowed to do in the dominant culture either when it comes to marriage. So, for example, for those of you who may be unmarried young women out there, how many times have you started to get talked to by a parent or an aunt or a grandmother or somebody about when are you going to get married, when are you going to have kids, right? Women start getting talked to about that fairly early on in their 20s. Men, not as much. Men don't get starting to talk to about that as much, usually until late 20s, early 30s, if then. What about career, right? How, and that's certainly changed in the last 50 years, but again, what are our expectations about what kinds of careers we can do? Can you be a nurse? Can you be a doctor? And of course, can anyone do that? Sure. Well, assuming you have the intellectual capability of doing that. But you can do that, but what are the societal expectations? Well, the societal expectations are that if you're a nurse, you're a woman. Societal expectations are that anyone can be a teacher, but if you're teaching in the younger grades, you're more likely female, and if you're teaching in the male grade, you're more likely, or in the upper grade, you're more likely male. So again, our expectations kind of shape what we see, and what we see is different. Finally, they talk about the relationship with the parents and talking about how the children are growing from the parents, right? They're really not following everything, what kids do. I'd like to know, really. Right? You are probably going a different path than your parents thought you would. I know I am. And I know that my kids are going to go in a different path, and I have only so much ability to shape what that path is. So thinking about, again, what are the expectations with what your relationship is supposed to be like with your parents, that differs. So that's mainly what I want you to look at. Also, I thought it was interesting that at the end, Suha talks about this twist towards assimilation, that as you're looking at this show, if you have one group that's saying, you know, oh, they're not showing Muslims as terrorists at all, Suhad's saying, you know, but here's my other complaint, which is completely on the opposite side, that maybe they're showing it as very assimilationist, trying to fit in a lot. And maybe that doesn't always happen in a lot of families who live in this area. So that's what we have for this chapter, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.